Sure. Zelensky did a slightly strange thing some time ago. He broke into part of Russia in the Kursk region. There wasn't much questioning at the time about exactly why, when there's so much else to defend, particularly in the Donbass region. I think we still have to go back to why exactly did Zelensky do this? Sort of a tactical move. Did it have a strategic outcome in mind? Secondly, what's happened since then? Russia's been gradually pushing back, and I think they've almost retaken almost maybe 50% of the territory. So the counter question to this is, what's in Putin's mind? Why doesn't he just sort of leave it and concentrate on the thing he really cares about? So what's the advantage for him?
It's been an interesting. I know when the Ukrainians first did the attack, I think it was back in August. They caught everybody by surprise by basically invading Russia. They call it an incursion, but I think it was the first time since the Second World War that Russia's actually been invaded, and it was an audacious act. Now, we don't know, but military analysts assumed that this was because Russia would be so embarrassed, President Putin would be so humiliated that he was not able to protect Russia, that he would move his forces away from the front line in the Donbass to address this new threat in the Kursk region and actually get rid of it. So we waited, but actually Russia didn't do that. Ukraine pushed further and further in, and then eventually stopped because the Ukrainians were pretty clear. They've no intention of holding this ground. They were going to hold it for as long as militarily expedient. But actually what Putin did was just put a ring of steel around it and then carried on fighting in the Donbass. That just meant that Ukraine was even shorter of manpower, and it hasn't got a lot of soldiers anyway. And so all sorts of questions asked about whether this was the right thing to do. Now it turns out that Russia has put 59,000 troops into the area. Apparently there are plans to put the 11,000 North Korean troops in there as well. And they have pushed Ukraine out of 40% of the territory that they once held. And I know that a couple of interviews, I've chatted to a Ukrainian earlier in the week, and they were going, what was that for? Why did we do it? What a waste of time. And I do think it's an interesting to scratch the surface of it, because what we don't know is how humiliating this was for Putin back in Russia. He is Mr. Security, and yet he wasn't able to keep the country's borders secure. People who had to flee the area would have talked in Russia. Therefore, he can't hide it. The question is, why now? Why is Russia pushing back now? And I think that's the really interesting conundrum at the moment.
So we've sort of touched on this before, that if there's an assumption that there's going to be a negotiated settlement, then all sides, particularly both sides, Ukraine and Russia, need as many cards up their sleeve as possible when you're actually doing a trade. One thought was that Kursk is actually a card in the final negotiation, and if Zelensky still holds it, then that means he loses less elsewhere, and vice versa for Putin. I mean, is that still, particularly given the pressure that's coming into the system from the Trump win and the 20th of January, is that still a potential explanation for what's going on?
I think you've probably got your finger on the button of this, Bern, is that up till now, up to very recently, Russia largely seems to have ignored this incursion. So why have they suddenly decided now they've got to get rid of it? And I think you're right, is that, one of the assumptions now is that if you're Putin, it's been an incredibly damaging war. It's been damaging, you expect it to be over in a few days. It's now over 1,000 days. The lives, the cost, the impact on your economy. You are grinding forward. You are winning, whatever that means. But you are going to have a weather eye on how is this going to end. And one of the things we're seeing is an increase in activity on the front line, an increase in the casualty rates. And this time of year, winter, you generally see everything tailing off. All of that leads itself to believe that Putin thinks that the new administration in America, 20th of January, there is the prospect of a potential for negotiation. And if that's the case, exactly as you say, everybody's trying to position themselves. And if that was the case, pretty much guaranteed Putin would not want Ukraine to hold any Russian territory at that time.
It's even a tiny bit of territory is huge, because how could Putin ever finish the negotiation, leave the table with a little bit of Russia being, quote, owned by Ukraine? That can't happen, can it?
No, I mean, it's almost impossible to see that. And I think the interesting conundrum here, therefore, is politically, I'm pretty confident Zelensky would love to hold on to some land in the Kursk region. Militarily, though, what are his commanders going to be saying? Is it worth Custer's last stand?
Yeah.
Because you want to hold out, or do you go, that's probably not a fight we can win, and actually we don't want to have some of Russian territory, and the danger is that the longer we hold out there, the fewer resources we have to actually protect the ground that we do want to protect. And I think there'll be really interesting behind the scenes conversations here. And the final element I would just add is that there's been a lot of talk about these North Korean troops, and if you listen to the language carefully, Russia has regularly said they will not be used for the fight in Ukraine. Now, whether we believe or not is another matter, but it does feel that they could be used to liberate Russia. In other words, they could be used in the fight in the Kursk region against Ukrainian soldiers in there. And therefore, if you were Ukrainian soldiers, you know you're going to not only face 50-odd thousand Russian troops, but also a wave of North Korean troops. The odds are going to be increasingly stacked against you. And therefore, prudence might dictate that a managed withdrawal might well be...
By Zelensky
might well be the best way to manage this. So although we're hearing the headlines of, is that because Ukraine is being defeated, or is that a managed withdrawal? I just find it's the military tactics and the conundrum between political pressure and military pressure here.
Well, it's one of those subjects where on the surface, the casual observer might think, actually, this is quite straightforward. Somebody takes a bit of territory, somebody else takes it back again. The politics behind this, I think, is actually quite extraordinary. And I'll try something on you in a second. But back to your point about the North Koreans, Sir Richard Gere, former chief of MI6, gave a big interview on television quite recently. He touched on the North Korean. Either he agrees with you or you agree with him. But the implication behind what he was saying was, it might sound great to have an extra 10,000 soldiers, but his position was that these soldiers come from an autistic regime in North Korea. These are not battle-hardened individuals. Culturally, they're very different. Actually, to integrate them into a winning force would be quite difficult. And actually, the complications of that might, break down the capability rather than, strengthen it.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is we just don't know. I mean, sometimes quantity, we've said many times, quantity has a quality all of its own. An extra 11,000 troops, potentially that you're going to use as cannon fodder, that you don't care that you can't talk to them. You don't care that they're not well trained. You don't care they're not battle hardened.
You've got a rifle, point it at
somebody in charge. And if it means you die rather than a Russian soldier die, and bluntly, I doubt that the North Korean leader really cares. I think he cares much more that he's getting paid in oil for all of this support. He's getting more support for his military, and no longer is he feeling isolated on the world stage. And therefore, tragically, I don't suppose he really cares about the North Korean troops. But in terms of the embattled Ukrainian forces, I think that's where, and also, I mean, we've been following this for the last couple of years. Every winter, I know it's obvious, but it's worth mentioning again. All the foliage falls off the trees. You no longer have any cover for troops to move around covertly on the battlefield. It's also festeringly cold over there. It's a lot colder than it is in the UK. The ground hardens up, so you can't easily dig foxholes, and just surviving is very, very difficult. So generally speaking, we see a massive tail off, sort of middle October, end of October in fighting. We've not really seen that this year. And that's not because it's easy fighting. It's clearly because Russia is just pushing really, really hard. 1,500 casualties a day, as announced by Chief of the Defense Staff. That's half as many again as through the Battle of Bakhmut, the worst battle since World War II. There has to be a reason why Russia's pushing so hard. And even the language from the Kremlin is more, President Putin is always ready to talk. And it feels like we're teeing ourselves up for a conversation that when President Trump gets in, the worry is, what is that negotiation going to look like?
Well, can I drop something else on you for you to try and join the dots? Because there appears to be two opposing forces politically going on in terms of this conflict at the moment. We appear to have the American administration prior to the 20th of January encouraging more capability within Ukraine in terms of their permission to use things. Very recently, Ursula von der Leyen in Brussels stood up and said, we stand by Ukraine. We're going to continue. We can, the implication is actually we can win this war. Let's not give up. On behalf of the European Union, we are committing a whole series of additional funds to support Ukraine. Whether they speak for the individual countries or not, I think is not clear. We know there is actually dissent. And of course, in lockstep, and it always happens right now, David Lammy stood up pretty much, minutes after Ursula von der Leyen was, and he was saying basically the same thing. My worry is this feels a bit like pushback against what Trump is going to do, or what he threatens to do, which is to basically stop the war completely, which inevitably means a negotiated settlement.
Yeah, but I think what it does expose, and I think we're going to get onto this, is that there's a differing view. So Biden doesn't want to lose the war. Trump doesn't want the war to continue. And on an America First policy, where America's thousands of miles away from Russia, it's probably little more than it's a blip. It's costs a lot of money. Who cares? For Europeans, it's on a doorstep. You're feeling the heat of this very, very directly. And bluntly, despite all the West has done, I don't want to sound flippant, but we have managed to keep Ukraine in the game, but not actually done enough to allow Ukraine to prevail. And in a way, I think history will judge us very unkindly that Putin's managed to rattle his nuclear saber, stopped the West from pushing too far, and therefore the West has. I mean, let's be clear. Russian economy is about the size of Italy's. The West, even Europe, has got a massively bigger economy, a better defense industrial base. We've just not chosen to use it, and therefore we are managing the decline of Ukraine. We don't really want Putin to win, but we're not prepared to engage to stop him winning. We have the ability to do that. And because we've perpetuated it so long, I think America's just gone tired of this and gone, look, our focus is China, Europe, you're close to this, deal with Russia. And bluntly, we could put a no-fly zone in, we could do all sorts of things to stop Russia in its tracks. And I think there's some profound lessons that the West has got from this. And inevitably, saying the answer is NATO, it's not. NATO is a collection of countries about self-preservation. Ukraine isn't in that. So this is about standing up for our way of life and stopping threats, stopping the bully from prevailing. So I do think there's some really interesting cracks appearing in NATO. But also, let's be really clear, we're not helping Ukraine win. We're just doing enough to let it survive. And I think we should be absolutely clear about that. Political statements, we stand to Ukraine till the end, are all very well, but we are very mooted in what we're prepared to do.
Well, it's expensive as well, isn't it? You've got to convince your local population better to spend money in Ukraine than on the NHS, which in world terms is a poor performing health system, or give more money to the police. Crime is up in certain areas. So, it's a tough call politically. Maybe we come back to this one on another occasion, because there's other developments, new sanctions being proposed by the EU against Putin. For instance, no fly zones, not in war, but no commercial fly zone. So there's, the other, resistance outside of the defense direct one is sort of piling up against Putin as well. Again, we can debate whether the last ones were successful.
Yeah, but my skepticism about this is that I hope I'm wrong, but if Trump is going to bring the war to an end, he can't impose something on President Putin. He has to do as a carrot and stick, doesn't he? So what incentives are you going to offer Putin, who's on the front foot, who is winning? What incentives are you going to offer him to stop? And one of those incentives is probably going to be a conversation around sanctions.
And trade, yeah.
Because Putin's almost certainly going to say, let's get rid of all these sanctions. So it's all very well us tweaking the dial on sanctions. Is it hurting? Almost certainly, yes. Will it stop the war? No. And will those likely be taken off the table the moment there's a negotiated settlement? Yes. So it's deeply worrying, and I think we're going to get into it in a separate topic. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that there's a difference between America's position and some European countries.